Today's lessons are about air masses and fronts. Well, air masses are just large bodies of air that share similar characteristics throughout. And on our map here, we're going to talk about those air masses that affect us. Starting with this one right here, the one that's labeled MP. Well, that is a symbol that means an air mass that is labeled maritime polar. Maritime polar. Polar you probably recognize. Polar just means really cold air. And you can see that this arrow is coming from the North Pole. And so you understand that that's cold. But the word we probably don't recognize is the word maritime. Well, let's look at it. The prefix mary, it actually means ocean or water. Now where you have seen that prefix is probably in a word such as submarine. Sub is a prefix that means below, and mary means water. So literally a submarine is a vehicle that travels under water. Well, in this sense, in the word maritime, it means that it is a body of air that has formed over some water. And as that water evaporates, it carries a lot of moisture with it, and that body of air is going to be very moist, very humid. So the air that comes over Washington State and Oregon and some of California is maritime polar. Another type of air mass that can affect us is A, which stands for Arctic. That just means super duper cold. The one toward the middle, let me put my picture back. The one toward the middle is called CP, and that stands for continental polar. Continental, it kind of looks like the word continent, and that's going to help you understand what it means. Right above the United States is a large body of land called Canada. And Canada, since it's such a large body of land, when that air evaporates over that body of land, it tends to be dry. So continental means really dry air. And polar, we just looked at, means cold. So literally, right up here near the Great Lakes, that air is going to be dry and cold. We call it continental and polar. And we've just looked at maritime polar. Off the Atlantic Ocean, we also get a body of air that is very moist. And the fact that it's coming from the North Pole means it's very cold. So the New England states, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Maine, all of those places up there typically see maritime polar air. Now going toward the southern portion of the United States, right where we live right here is in South Carolina and Georgia, we have what's called maritime tropical. And maritime, again, means a body of air that forms over water, so it tends to be very humid. And we know that because we have a lot of humid days, especially in the fall, in August and September when we come back to school. Tropical means that it's also very warm. This arrow is red, and it indicates that this is a body of air that's coming from closer from the equator, so it tends to be very warm. We also have maritime tropical coming from the Gulf of Mexico that affects Alabama, Mississippi, and some of those states. And then you'll notice another maritime tropical that's coming off of the Pacific Ocean, and this affects Baja California, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. And so this tends to be warm, moist air. Now, right over here above Texas, we have the last type of air mass, and that's called continental tropical. We saw continental up here, where it's a body of air that forms over a big area of land, and so it tends to be dry. Well, the same is true here. Over Texas, it tends to get continental tropical, dry, hot air because it's coming from directly over Mexico, and Mexico is closer to the equator. So this air is very dry and warm. All right, so that is a rundown on our different types of air masses. Now, what's really cool is when these guys try to run into each other. For example, when an Arctic swings down from Canada and maybe tries to run into a continental tropical, some interesting things happen. And so when these air masses meet, they form what is called a front. And a front, a way you can remember, is like a fight when two people are staring each other down and there's going to be a fight. So remember, front starts with an F and so does fight. Now let's look at some of those fronts. And before we do, we got to look at the characteristics of hot air masses and cold air masses and what they tend to do when they get into their fights. This is a cold air mass, and the trick to remember that it sinks is to look at the D in the word cold, and that stands for down. So cold air goes down. It always sinks. So that's its signature wrestling move. And then the warm guy over here, his phrase is warm rises, and we remember the R in warm means that it rises. So its signature move is always going to be kind of on top. It's always going to come in and rise over its competitor. All right, now onto the fronts. The first one we're going to look at is the stationary front. Stationary is a word that means you're not going anywhere. Stationary means still. And in this case, it's where a warm air mass and a cold air mass push each other, but neither wins. The way this would kind of look is if you look at this cold air, which is indicated by the little blue structure here, it's going to be cold. Look at his teeth. These teeth are in triangle blue shapes, and what that means is a kind of a trick to help you to remember that that's the symbol for a cold front. In this case, it's just a cold air mass right now. And then over here, you'll notice that this guy has sunshades because he's probably on vacation around in the Bahamas, somewhere warm. And look at the shape of his mouth as well. So they all kind of look like semicircles. So when we look at this shape, the symbol, all the red semicircles represent warm air. Now, we said they were pushing against each other. And what's happening is that the cold air, which is just as strong as the warm air, is trying to push in this direction. And the same goes for the warm air. It's trying to push in this direction, but they're equally matched. So what winds up happening is several days of overcast weather, and it's kind of drizzly. They just kind of fizzle out. They get tired of each other. They keep pushing, 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 but they get tired, and then they just fall apart. So just some drizzly weather, nothing severe. Now, I want you to notice the position of these symbols. Notice that the point of these little icicle shapes, which again stands for cold air masses, they're pointed in the right direction. So that indicates that this air mass is trying to move toward the right. And then if you look at the warm air, you'll notice that the point of the semicircle is going in the left direction. So that's how you know which way the air masses are moving when you see them on a map. Whichever way that the tips are pointing lets you know how they're trying to move. All right, now we're going to go to look at a sort of real picture of what a stationary front looks like. Notice the symbol right here. This warm air is trying to go toward the left. This cold air is trying to go toward the right. And again, you get some stratus clouds that produces some drizzle for several days. All right, the next type of front. Now this is where it gets really interesting. This is a cold front, and he's bad. Okay, cold air beats up warm air with an uppercut. That's its signature move. Remember that cold air, the only thing it can do is sink. So what it's going to do is slide up and under the warm air, and they go kapow, and it pushes it way up very quickly in the atmosphere. And as a result of that, you have this really tall cloud that's built that's called a cumulonimbus cloud. And those are the guys that make thunderstorms and tornadoes and hurricanes. And with that, sometimes the thunderstorms produce hail. And it's because this happens really powerful, really fast. That cold air, he's a killer. All right, and you'll notice that the symbol there for that is cold front. It's the one that you'll see when you know that the cold air won. And here's a real picture of what it may look like. Notice that cumulonimbus cloud. You can see that the cold air is trying to come toward the right, and it's winning. It's doing a great job. That warm air has no choice but to go up, 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 up very quickly, and that's what produces that cumulonimbus cloud. All right. The next type of front is the warm front, and it's named warm front because now the warm air is going to win. So the signature move for the warm air mass is where the warm air puts cold air in a sleeper hold. Remember, it rises, so the only move it's got is to kind of sneak attack on top and then try to put them in a sleeper hold. And it's a very slow moving type of front. Look, he's on vacation. He's relaxed. He doesn't have to rush. He's just taking his time. But the slower that these move, the less severe the weather and the longer the weather sticks around. So we're going to have some drizzle, which can stay around for a few days. And these are formed from stratus clouds. Okay, a real picture of what that might look like. You notice that the warm air is moving toward the right. You can see that the warm is winning, and it's sliding up and over the cold air, and it does it really slow. Okay, the next one, I think this one's my favorite, is the occluded front. Now, with the occluded front, a trick to help you to kind of remember something about it is that in the word occluded, there's two C's. That helps you to remember that there are two cold air masses and one warm air mass that's involved in this fight. We call this a three-way brawl. So here's how the story goes. First, there's a little baby cold air mass that's by himself. And he's really not powerful. He's kind of weak. And you'll notice he's got little teeny teeth, little teeny icicles. He's not very strong. But here comes this warm air mass, and he's like, hey, you're small. I think I'm just going to beat you up. Get out of my ring. So he's going to come by, and he's moving really slowly. And then what he's going to do is do that sleeper hold like we were talking about. But wait a minute. Doom, doom, doom. Hey, nobody's messing with my baby. Here comes Big Mama. This is a second cold front, or cold air mass, but this one's even bigger. Super big. And nobody's messing with Mama. So she comes by, and again, her only move is to slide under these air masses. And what she does, since she's so mad, what happens is that she winds up kicking both of them up into the sky. And so all three of these air masses are moving in the same direction. Two colds and one warm. Now I want you to look at the symbol, and you'll notice that on that line that all of the shapes are on the same side of the line. And again, that indicates that all the warm and the cold air are all moving in the same direction. And since red and blue, they make purple, you'll often see occluded front symbols in purple. But if you see it in black and white, well, actually you'd see it in black. If you look at the alternating triangles and semicircles, that's how you'll know it's an occluded front. Now to take a picture, a real picture of what that looks like, you'll notice the three-way brawl here. Here's the super big mama cold air mass. Here's it's called a receding cold. That just means it's weaker. So this is a little cold air mass, and here's that warm air mass. And all three of these together, what they're going to do is to produce some very scattered type of weather patterns. Some rain, some drizzle, cloudy. It's kind of a mixture, but really nothing severe. So remember, occluded has two C's that stand for two cold air masses. Okay, that about takes care of all of our fronts, but I just want us to review the symbols. So starting with the warm front. Warm front looks like this with the red semicircles, and the cold front looks like the icicles. The occluded front has all the symbols on the same side. The stationary front, since they're fighting and pushing against each other, you'll have one set of symbols, like for the cold air mass on one side, and another set, the warm air mass, on the other side. Now, I want to wrap up our lesson by showing you some of these fronts in action. So we're going to start with, see if I can move this over here a little bit. We're going to start with what the cold front looks like. I want you to see it as it's building. Notice it says cumulonimbus clouds. That's the only type of cloud that can really form from a cold front. And you can see that as that cold pushes under the warm slides up and over the cold, but it does it very quickly to form those cumulonimbus clouds. And then lastly, the warm front. Now this is where you get all of the other cloud types. And what you notice is that as that warm air slides up in altitude over the cold air, all of the different kinds of clouds are forming, with the top being cirrus, the bottom being stratus. All right, that takes care of it. Hope you learned something.